तिमिरन्धस्य ज्ञानञ्जनाशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मीलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः। श्रीचैतन्यमनोभीष्टं स्थापितं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपकदा मायं ददाति स्वापदान्तिकम्। जय श्रीकृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानन्द श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौरभक्तवृंद। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। मुखं करोति वाचालं पङ्गुं लङ्घयते गिरिं यत्कृपातमहं वन्दे श्रीगुरुदीनतारुणं परमानन्दं माधवम्। नमो ॐ विष्णुपदाय कृष्णपृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमतिरोपस्वामितनामिने नमो पृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमति भक्तिवेदांत स्वामित नामिने। जय श्री Hare Krishna. Thank you so much for joining. So we will resume our discussion from the sixth canto, chapter 1, verse 42. So just to re-establish the context, these set of verses are spoken by the Yamadutas to Vishnudutas. And the Vishnudutas had asked Yamadutas some basic questions like what is dharma, what is adharma. And the Yamadutas are themselves very well situated in tattva, in the Vedic tattva. So they're very expertly answering all the questions. And so the Vishnu asked Dharmasya Tattvam, that what is religion? And they said Veda Pranahito Dharmo. That which is prescribed in the Vedas constitutes dharma. And Adharmasya Lakshanam, what is irreligion? They said Adharma Tada Vipraya. That which is not prescribed in the Vedas is dharma. And they also establish the source of their own knowledge. They say that we have heard this iti shushuruma, that we have heard this from our spiritual master, Lord Yamraj. So expanding on this, on this theme of dharma being non-different from the personality of Godhead, they now start glorifying the position of Lord Narayan. So we notice that it's almost like the Vishnu Dutas are speaking. Right? So in one way, this is the expertise of the Vishnu Dutas, that they are getting the Yamadutas to make the case for them. So we see that the Yamadutas, they're uh, uh, they're not really misguided. They have a clear understanding and a desire to do the right thing. But this particular pastime, to some extent, is bewildering to them. So they're genuinely bewildered. It's not that they are bewildered because of malice or because they are keen to take Ajmail and punish him. And one of the important qualities of the young Dutas is their mode of neutrality. That just like Yamraj is in a mood of neutrality, rewarding and punishing, the Yamadutas also inherit that mood. So, having established the Vedas as non-different from the Lord, then they start establishing the position of the Lord. So, in the verse 41, they talk about three attributes of the Lord, that he is fully spiritual, eternally situated in the spiritual world. He is all powerful. He is controlling the entire material manifestation. And he is perfect. So everything that is done by him directly or indirectly is perfect. Right. So, and this gets us to verse 42. Suryogneh kamaruddevah सोमः सन्ध्यानिदेशः कंकु स्वयं धर्म इति अयेतदयस्य साक्षणः. The sun, fire, sky, air, demigods, moon, evening, day, night, directions, water, land, and Super Soul himself all witness the activities of the living entity. So, in the previous verse, the Yamdutas had made this point that Lord Narayan is fully spiritual and eternally situated in the spiritual world. So, the Vishnu Dutas may say, then perhaps because he is so farther removed, he may not have full understanding of what each jiva is performing. So, to answer this implicit question, the Yamdutas say this point that the various demigods. So here, when they say the sun, fire, sky, air, etc., they're talking about the presiding demigods of these planets, right? And included in this is super soul. The super soul is present, accompanying every jiva, and is present accompanying every aspect of the material creation. So even if somehow the devas who could be fallible are not able to record, the super soul, who is Lord Narayan and therefore infallible, will record. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada says that we can understand from the Shastra there are many witnesses, including the sun, fire, etc., who sit with the individual search soul within this heart. Where is the dearth of witnesses? The witness and the Supreme Lord both exist. And therefore, so many living entities are elevated to higher planetary systems or degraded to low planetary systems, including the hellish planets. There are no discrepancies for everything arranged perfectly by the management of the Supreme Lord. Swabhaviki Jnana Bala Kriyacha. So, one of the questions one may ask is, in contemporary situations, when we see that there are multiple people who are supervising the same job or who are overlooking the same job, it points to the fallibility of them. Maybe one can be fallible and the other person catches the mistakes. So, is that what's happening here? That maybe the sun can miss what's happening at night, so the moon catches it, and maybe the moon misses what's happening during sandhyas, so the air catches it, and maybe the air misses what's happening um, when one is beyond the atmosphere, so the sky catches it. So it's not really that. In the scriptures, it is said that there are different kinds of activities that are executed by the jiva in either piety or impiety. So the broad category we know that some of them are by body, some of them by mind, and some of them by thoughts. So the moon is the presiding deity of the mind or the intelligence. And then it notes the sins or the piety that is covered by thoughts. In the Kali Yuga, it is said that if one commits sins by the mind, it's not considered to be a sin. But if one commits pious activities by the mind, then they are actually considered as pious. Similarly, there are other categories of activities, sometimes performed through yajnas, sometimes charity, sometimes for the benefit of animals, and all the various devas are recording these different categories of activities. So it's not that they're backing one another up or they're checking on another or they all take notes and at the end of the day they are reconciled. But for the sake of completeness, because the jiva is acting in so many ways, driven by so many impetuses, the action manifesting in so many ways, everything is being captured by different devas, and ultimately the super soul is sitting right next to the to the soul. In Prabhupada Leela Amrita Volume 1, it is noted that when he was a student, one of his Christian professors made the point that the law of karma is actually fallible because of lack of witnesses. And obviously, Srila Prabhupada remembered that. And here he addresses that misconception. He says that we once had a discussion with a learned Krishna professor who argued that although people are generally punished after the witnesses of their misdeeds are examined, where are the witnesses responsible for once suffering the reactions of past karma? Now, again, the Christian theology also believes in this notion of one being held accountable for the pious and impious activities, but they have a very broad stroke. They consider that at the end of the day, unless one surrenders to Christ, and all activities are impious. And even though it's material, but in a broader conception, it's not very different from Vaishnava theology, where even in the Bhagavad Gita, it is said that whether it is pious or impious activities, as long as they're material, they're simply binding one to the material world. And unless one surrenders to Krishna or his representative, one will continue to suffer this cycle of repeated birth and death. There is similarities. The difference, of course, is in the completeness of understanding in Christianity. Since they do not subscribe to the notion of reincarnation, then a lot of the theology is curtailed by 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 a single birth being responsible for the eternal destination of that particular living entity. So anyway, the Yamadutas here are making this point that that there is no dearth of witnesses. Next verse, 43. एतेर धर्म विज्ञाता स्थानं दन्दस्य युज्यते सर्वे कर्मानुरोधेन दण्डम् अर्हन्ति कारिणः. The candidates for punishment are those who are confirmed by these many witnesses to have deviated from their prescribed regulative duties. Everyone engaged in fruitive activities is suitable to be subject to punishment according to his sinful acts. So, the reasons for the punishment and the candidates for the punishment are mentioned in this verse. So the Vishnu Dutas had asked this question to the Yam Dutas, who is a suitable candidate for punishment? And the Yam Dutas are responding over here that those that are confirmed by this impartial witnesses to have performed sinful activities are suitable candidates for punishment. Now they also say that everyone is engaged in fruitive activity and they are all subjected to punishment according to his sinful acts. And so they're almost analogously making the statement that all material activities, good or bad, are bad. And this will be expanded in the next verse. Sambhavanti hi bhadrani vipritani chanagaha karinam gunasangaste devahanna karmakrat. O inhabitants of Vaikuntha, you are sinless. But those within this material world are all karmis, whether acting piously or impiously. Both kinds of actions are possible for them because they're contaminated by the three modes of nature and must act accordingly. One who has accepted a material body cannot be inactive. And sinful action is inevitable for one acting under the modes of material nature. Therefore, all the living entities within this material world are punishable. So you see that the Yamadutas have attentively heard the Bhagavad Gita. This is a This is really a summary of Bhagavad Gita. They're making the essential points that Krishna makes, especially in the earlier 6 chapters, especially third, fourth, and fifth, which deal with karma, and that uh, all activities, whether they're pious or impious, are contaminated by the three modes of material nature. The pious activities by the mode of goodness, and the impious activities by a mode of passion or ignorance. Right? And then they answer the implicit question, that is, does anybody escape? They said no. That anybody who has accepted a material body cannot be inactive. Right? Almost exactly the words Krishna says, that that it is not possible for the soul to be inactive even for a moment. So the conclusion that they draw is all the living entities with this material world are punishable. So the Yamadutas, we see that they address the Vishnu Dutas as Anaga. So Anaga means that this does not apply to you. The Anaga means sinless. That you are residents of the spiritual world, so this does not apply to you, and maybe you don't even understand this concept. How each and every resident of the material world are by nature sinful. Now everything is going to come down to Ajamel. Ajamel is a resident of the material world. So even if there was some ambiguity about the nature of his activities, just the fact that he has a material body contaminated by the modes in the material world, he becomes a candidate for punishment. So, like I said, this verse is also almost a synopsis of the Bhagavad Gita. So the point that they made is that everybody is driven by the material modes of nature. Right? This is Bhagavad Gita 14.5, where Krishna says that when the eternal living entity comes in contact with nature, he becomes conditioned by them. Right? Then the point they made is that these gunas are the cause of all kinds of activities, pious or impious. So this is 327. Prakriti kriyamanani gunakarmani karpasham. Third point they made is the nature of activities is that they will be pious or impious. To say that the person has led a life of dharma or adharma is a generalization, because even pious people commit impious activities, and even impious people perform pious activities. Right? This is 113. Nimitani cha pashyami vipratani keshava. Right? Arjun says the nature of the material world is that whatever action you do, you get the opposite result. Now, one may consider that performing no activities, one can avoid this situation. But then they also say that is not possible. Inactivity is not an option. So this is Bhagavad Gita 3.5. Nahi kashakshanamapi jatu tishta karmaka. And then they give the conclusion that everyone residing in this material world is subject to be punished. Right. So essentially they're saying that therefore Ajamel is also subject to be punished. Okay, moving on to verse 45. Yena yavan yatha dharmo dharmo veha sametah saeva tat phalam bhongte tatha tavadamutravai. In proportion to the extent of one's religious or irreligious actions in this life, one must enjoy or suffer the corresponding reactions of his karma in the next. So here they are answering the question, how is the punishment administered? And the answer is that it is administered in proportion to the pious and sinful activities performed by them. So this is essentially a succinct description of the rather complex law of karma. Sometimes when people ask law of karma, And simply you say one of the easy description explanation is you do good things will happen to you. You do bad things will happen to you. And Prabhupada in the purport states Bhagavad Gita 14:18, Urdham gachanti satvasta madhya tishtanti rajasa jaganya guna vrittista adu gachanti tamasa. That the destination of the modes, Urdham gachanti satvasta, those in the material mode of goodness, they go to the higher planets. Madhyante tishte rajasa. The rajasic people, they stay in the middle planets. And Jaganya Guna Vritistaha, those who are in the abominable mode of ignorance, Adu Gacchati Tamasaha. They go down to the hellish life. Next verse 46. Yateha dev pravarasa traividyam upalabhyate bhuteshu guna vaichatra tatha tathayantranamiyate. O best of the demigods, we can see three different varieties of life which are due to the contamination of the three modes of nature. The living entities are thus known as peaceful, restless, and foolish, as happy, unhappy, or in between, or as religious, irreligious, and semi religious. We can deduce that in the next life, these three kinds of material nature will similarly act. So the Yamadutas are expanding on the law of karma in terms of its impact. Right? So verses 45 and 46 indicate how one's past and present are reflected in one's current situation. So one's past behavior determines one's present, and one's present behavior determines one's future. Right? So this is the ongoing impact of the law of karma. So because of their past activities, they get one of the three categories of life form. So the Yamdutas say peaceful, restless, and foolish. So this is goodness, passion, and ignorance. Happy, unhappy, and between. So this is goodness, ignorance, and passion. And religious, irreligious, and semi-religious. This is goodness, ignorance, and passion, mixed modes of goodness and passion. So they say we can reduce that in the next life. These three kinds of material acts will similarly act. Right? So what it means is that the law of karma is self-perpetuating. That based on one's action, one gets in one of these three categories of propensity. Based on the propensity, they perform commensurate kinds of action. And because of that, they are similarly bound to, once again, those forms of life. And so Prabhupada, in the purport, he gives a solution. He says that the best policy is to dissociate oneself with the three modes of material nature and be transcendental to their contamination. Mam cha vibhacharena bhakti yogena sevata. Sagunan samityetan brahma bhuyate kalpate. One of Prabhupada's favorite verses. He quotes that very often. Mam cha vibhacharena bhakti yogena sevata. So one who performs executes devotional service, he transcends Sarguna Samityeta, and then Brahma Bhuyati Kalpate. He comes to the spiritual platform. Okay, verse 47. Vartamano anyaho kalo guna bijana papoyata evam janmayayoreta dharma dharma nidarshanam. Just as springtime in the present indicates the nature of springtime in the past and future, so this life of happiness or distress, life of happiness, distress, or a mixture of both gives evidence concerning the religious and irreligious activities of one's past and future lives. So, if you see that what the Yamadutas are explaining to Vishnudutas is very similar to what devotees will also preach when they speak to others. That what is the proof of the law of karma? So, what is the proof that we say? is that we look around us, we see there are some people happy and some people unhappy and some people in in the mixed mode. Why is it that? It is because of their pious or impious activities in previous lives. Why does somebody take birth in a rich family? Why does somebody take birth in a diseased body? Right. So at the time of birth, they have still not performed any activities that for which they should be punished. But the matter of fact is that there are some living entities that are punished even at from the moment of birth. Things like taking birth in a very poor family, or taking birth in a diseased body, or with a certain propensity, mental propensity. Why? So this is a indication of the extent of dharma and adharma in the previous life. And by extrapolation, one can also understand that this cycle will continue in the future lives. So Prabhupada explains in the purport that as soon as spring arrives, the usual exhibition of the various types of fruits and flowers automatically become manifest. And therefore, we may conclude that the spring in the past was adorned with similar fruits and flowers and will be so adorned in the future also. So, a repetition of birth and death is taking place with time, and according to the influence of the modes of nature, we are receiving various types of body being subject to various conditions. So, this means that when we look around us, we see birth and death, we can understand that this happened in the past and will happen in the future. Also, when we look around us, we see people performing sinful and pious activities. We can also understand this happened in the past and will happen in the future. And the law of karma essentially correlates that. That by seeing the current spring, we can understand how the prior spring was. By seeing one's current state in life, one can understand what one's previous life was. And same is true for devotees also. Sometimes you see that people very quickly take to Krishna consciousness. That you have to do very little preaching to them. And Prabhupada gives the example of wet wood and dry wood. That they're like dry wood, little bit of spark and then they're blazing. And then there are some people who will never take to it. And I remember there was a person who was we are associating with, and um, for a long time, almost like 10, 12 years, but did not move beyond a certain point. Did not want to chant, and had some understanding of philosophy, but not beyond that. He liked the association of devotees, liked prasadam, but very, he had set up very strong boundaries around himself. I'll not do this, I'll not do that. He had become a vegetarian, but many things he did not do. And I was once discussing with Guru Maharaj, and he said that you have to understand there are some people that will never take to Krishna consciousness. It's not a matter of are you potent enough to preach, or am I potent enough to preach, or is the philosophy potent? He says all of them, even if they line up, there are some people who will never take to it. And there are some people who are waiting to take to it. So, same thing in karma. We see some people are born very strongly pious by nature. There are some people who are born with very strong criminal propensities right from a young age. They will exhibit deviant behavior, right? So even before they have had chance to be conditioned by the current situation, right? All this is coming from previous life. Okay, moving on to verse 48. Manasev pure deva purva rupam vipashyati anumima masate purvam manasa bhagavanaja. The omnipotent Yamraj is as good as Lord Brahma. For while situated in his own abode or in everyone's heart like the Paramatma, he mentally observes the past activities of a living entity and thus understands how the living entity will act in future lives. So, what the Yamadutas have so far been talking about is principles, the generalized law of karma, right? And the Vishnu Dutas might say that these are general principles. But what about specifics? How does it apply to each and every person? So the Yamadutas address this implicit objection in this verse, saying that one is not judged by principles only. One is judged by principles applied to their specific situations. That's why karma becomes complicated. The principle of karma may be simple, but the implementation of that principle is very difficult. That's why they say there are only 12 Mahajans who understand completely the principles of dharma, or which includes karma. Because there are so many potentially contradicting situations. One should not lie. But should one lie to save another person's life? One should not kill. But can one kill to protect one's own life or the life of another person? And one should not eat meat. But what if one is starving and there is nothing else available? And so the principles of karma are very nuanced and difficult to understand. So the Yamadutas are addressing this implicit question from the Vishnudutas by saying, yes, it is true that the application of these principles is difficult. That is why our Lord Yamraj, he's as good as Lord Brahma. So Lord Brahma is the personification of intelligence. So Yamraj is intelligent. He's also one of the 12 Mahajans. So he's very intelligent, right? And not only that, he is able to observe the past activity of the living entity. So he is seeing everything that is happening, whether by his own potency or by the potency of the witnesses that were described. So two things are aligned in this verse. One is that everything that the jiva is doing is being observed, and the decision that is being made based on this observation is made by one who is got perfect knowledge of the law of karma. So that is why the Yamadutas are saying that there cannot be mistakes over here. The Yamadutas did not come on their own. They were dispatched by Lord Yamraj, right? So they're saying that our master is perfect. Since we follow the instructions of the master, we inherit that perfection. Prabhupada notes in the purport that one should not consider Yamraj as an ordinary living being. He is as good as Lord Brahma. He has complete cooperation of the Supreme Lord who is situated in everyone's heart, and therefore, by the grace of the Super Soul, he can see the past, present, and future of a living being from within. The word Anu Mimamsate means that he can decide in consultation with the Super Soul. Anu means following. The actual decisions concerning the next life of the living entities are made by the Super Soul and they are carried out by Yamraj. So Srila Prabhupada gives us a little bit deeper understanding because Yamraj is also a living entity and in the material world, he is also material conditioned. So the definition of one who's materially conditioned is that they are fallible. And there are different levels of fallibility, but there's always that notion of being fallible. And we see that Yamraj does make mistakes. That's why he was cursed by Manduka Rishi. So there are places where he makes mistakes, very rare, very exceptional. This is another place where he made a mistake. Now, the Yamdutas are saying that, or Srila Prabhupada is explaining that the fallibility of Yamraj is compensated by the fact that he is following the instructions of one who is infallible. So Anu means to follow, and Mimasate means that in following in consultation or following the decision or the instructions. So in the in the eighth chapter also, where the whole process of reincarnation was explained, then there it is also explained that the super soul actually coordinates this whole process of of reincarnation. There, under the guidance of the super soul, the jiva leaves one material body and takes on another with a particular combination of senses and desires. Okay, let's go to the next verse, verse 49. यथाज्ञस्तमसा युक्ता उपासते व्यक्तमेव हि न वेद पूर्वम् परम नष्टजन्म स्मृतिस्तथा. As a sleeping person acts according to the body manifested in his dreams and accepts it to be himself, so one identifies with his present body, which he acquired because of his past religious or irreligious actions, and is unable to know his past or future lives. So here the Yamadutas are expanding on one of the points they themselves made, that this cycle of karma is self-perpetuating. Right? So they had made this point that um, uh, by the present season, one can estimate what the past and future seasons will be. So if one looks at it from a different perspective, that if one knows that in the current winter there is suffering because of cold, if one can deduce that they had similarly suffered in the winters of the past, then will not they prepare for the winters in the future? Which means that when a jiva sees that he is suffering in the current material life, understanding that he had suffered in the previous life, and it means that he will also suffer in the future life, won't the person take steps to mitigate the future suffering? And the Yamduta says actually that does not happen. So they say, Nashta Janma Smriti Statha, that the memory of the past life is destroyed at the time of birth. So there's a difference between a philosophical understanding and an experiential understanding. So Prabhupada would say that one may say that if you touch this thing, it is hot and it will burn you. And depending on how much faith you have on the person who's telling you, you may or may not touch it. Or you may see other people touching it and getting burned. And again, depending on how much faith you have in them, you may or may not touch it. But when you have touched it yourself, then you know that it is burning. So when the jiva is born, the specific memory of the previous lives is destroyed. So nashta janma smritis katha. It's so even though the word nashta is used, nashta means that it is destroyed, but it is not actually destroyed. It is covered because it is said that this memory comes back later on. Similarly, the knowledge of future lives, that is given in the Vedas. And because the jivas identify with the present body, which is the result of past pious and impious activities, their understanding of the future also becomes contaminated. Because they lack the experiential memory of the previous lives, and because they lack the philosophical understanding of the future lives, they are not convinced to act in a way that the Vedas recommend. Which is why this cycle of birth and death is self-perpetuating. And so these are all points that were made over and over again in the Bhagavad Gita, And it's interesting to see it summarized in a few verses by the Yamaduta. Srila Prabhupada writes a pretty elaborate purport, and I'll go over it again. These are points that are not new to us, but it always helps to hear them again and have it reinforced. Right? So the points that Prabhupada makes in the purport is that a man engages in sinful activities because he does not know about his past life. That what did he do to get his present materially conditioned body? That in the present time, as stated by Rishabdev in Bhagavatam 554, a human being who is mad after sense gratification does not hesitate to act sinfully. Thus, it should be understood that a person who does not have Vedic knowledge always acts in ignorance of what he has done in the past, of what he is doing at present, and how he will suffer in future. He is completely in darkness and thus performs sins. Then, third point Prabhupada makes is that because of this, one receives an inferior or superior body at the discretion of the Paramatma. So then why doesn't one please Bhagwan to receive a better body? Now, when it's at the discretion of Paramatma, it does not mean at the whimsical discretion of the Paramatma, but it means that the Paramatma looks at one's pious and impious activities and then decides based on that. So then the question is that why doesn't one act in a way to get a better body? Why doesn't one simply perform dharmic activities? And the answer is agyas tamasa, because of gross ignorance. So what is this ignorance? So the ignorance is about the fact that one's present life is a result of one's past life activities. And the ignorance is that one's future life will be a result of one's present life activities. So the general ignorance about the, the continuing effect of one's activities in past, present, and future. So because the person is agyastamasa, because they lack that understanding, the result is that they're simply interested in the present body. Prabhupada says that he's simply interested in his present body like an animal who thinks that the ultimate goal of life is to eat as much as possible. And then Prabhupada asks the question, what is the solution? And then he answers that somehow or other one must be enlightened about past, present, and future. This is all possible when one is situated in the mode of goodness. The example of one who associates with the mode of goodness is a qualified Brahmana. Such a Brahmana knows past, present, and future because he consults the Vedic literature and sees through the eyes of Shastra Chakshu. He can understand what his past life was, why he is in the present body, and how he can obtain liberation from the clutches of Bhaya and not accept another material body. So, the essence of the verse is that when one begins to develop faith in the Vedas, and when one looks from the Vedic perspective, and one becomes convinced that how their actions are perpetuating their existence in either happiness or sin or distress or mixed mode. Then one further inquires from the Shastras as to how to escape the clutches of Maya or this repeated birth and death. Okay, do one more verse and then after that stop for any discussion. Verse 50. Panchabihi kurute swarthana panchavedat panchabi ekastu shodashena trin swayam saptadashosnute. About the five senses of perception, the five working senses, and the five objects of the senses in the mind, which is the 16th element. Above the mind is the 17th element, the soul, the living being himself, who, in cooperation with other 16, enjoys the material world alone. The living being enjoys three kinds of situations, namely happy, distressed, and mixed. Right? So this is an expansion on the nature of engagement between the jiva and the material world. So by the five action senses, like the hands, legs, eyes, ears, etc., one, the hands, legs, and the tongue, anus, genital. So one tries to attain one's desired objects. So these are the pancha karma indriyas. Then by the pancha jnana indriyas, which are the ears, eyes, etc., one tries to experience the enjoyment of the five sense objects, such as sound, sight, etc., under the supervision of the mind. And then, so that gets us to the 16 elements. The five karmendriyas, the five jnanendriyas, the five sense objects, and then the mind. And then the 17th is the jiva, that is, enjoys the three objects of the knowledge, senses, action senses, and mind. Right. And this results in three situations, namely happy, distressful, and mixed. So Srila Prabhupada again writes a long purport on this, and I'll quickly summarize it. So Prabhupada says that because of disobeying the Supreme Lord, one is put into material conditions. Here the living entity gets a body which is a complex combination of the 16 material elements. So we know that there are 8.4 million species, and the difference between the species is how these 16 elements combine with one another. Each species has a certain kind of karmendriyas and jnanendriyas and relate to the sense objects. So between these 16 material elements, we create the 8.4 million species. And when the person has gotten a particular kind of body, then he tries to improve his situation in a concocted way, not desiring to follow the instructions of the Supreme Lord. And the result of it is that three kinds of situations happen: happiness, distress, and the mixed situation. So next, Prabhupada in the purport provides a solution. He says that within this body, the jiva struggles alone, as indicated by the word ekas tu. So important to note this phrase ekas tu, that the jiva is struggling all by himself. So all by himself, the jiva is struggling for existence and enjoyment within this elements of nature. Nevertheless, the Supreme Lord, he comes himself to instruct the bewildered living entity how to act obediently and gradually return back to Godhead. And then Prabhupada says that just as the jiva struggles alone for material pleasure, the same is true for spiritual advancement. This is a very important statement. It is the responsibility of every jiva to try and remediate a situation. Others, the lords, the devotees may provide opportunities, but it is completely up to the jiva to avail of them. And so Prabhupada makes this point that everyone is responsible for their own situation, nobody else. You cannot blame the circumstances, the modes, the environment, because they're all passive. Right? So just like the jiva alone is responsible for one's material situation, the jiva alone is responsible for one's spiritual situation. So then one may say, what's the point that is made that the devotees are there, Vaishnava Sangha is there, Krishna is favorable? So all that is there, but there are opportunities. Krishna does not force anybody to become a devotee, but Krishna provides opportunities. It's up to the jiva to avail of them. Just like material nature provides opportunities to perform sinful and or pious activities. Up to the jivas to choose what they want to do. So in we see that in Bhagavatam 5.1, uh, uh, Priyavrata, he was initially leading a renounced life. And then Brahma asked him to become the ruler of the universe, and he does, and as part of that he marries. And then later on we see that Priyavrata, he condemns himself for becoming overly attached to his wife. He does not condemn Brahma, does not say that I was given a position in which I had to do so many passionate activities. He's very clear about it. He just condemns himself. Similarly, in Mahabharata, there is the pastime of King Yayati. Bhagavatam also is mentioned that he enjoys for a long time with Devyani material pleasures. But when realization awakens within him, he only condemns himself. He does not say that to Devyani that you were cooperating with me, and because you were dressing up nicely, I was attracted to you. And so these are great personalities, and they have understood this notion of ikastu, that I and I myself alone am responsible for it. Right? And ultimately, Srila Prabhupada says that what is the solution that you have to on your own follow? And then he quotes 1866, that Sarvadharman Pratyaja. And then he says the mood in which one should surrender is Ainanda Tanuja Kinkaram Patitama Vishmagovinda, the one of helplessness. Okay, so let me pause over here and see if there's any discussion.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. What I see is a lot of practicality within past few verses, right? Where the very last statement, what you just made, when realization happens, a devotee condemns himself, right? With two of these reference points. And also prior, we said very clear, which verse it was. In the verse 43, we do have a very clear instruction that the punishment of the devotees who will be punished are those who are confirmed by the many witnesses to have deviated from their prescribed regulative duties. But the question really is, even after going through with so much of learning, there are possibilities for a learned devotee or a learned scholar to go into a mode of assumptions, right? Like, yes, we did follow the regulative duties, part of the Vedas, but those assumptions may lead to different, again, karmic reactions or the responses. So the whole chapter is how to the conversation between Yamadutas and Vishnudutas, how to go back to God, right? Like how not to go into that pitfall of assumption based.
It's a very good question, Prabhu, and interestingly, that is one of the topics that Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur speaks extensively about in the next chapter. So you're saying assumption, I'm kind of paraphrasing it as speculation.
Okay.
And he speaks a lot about uh, the sin of speculation, actually. that how that holds back both devotees and non-devotees from making progress. Um, he does not offer a solution, but uh, from our perspective as practicing devotees, we know there are certain fundamental principles that can help us protect us from these assumptions or speculations. One is as Prabhupada will mention later on, is by following the footsteps of the perfected souls before us. So, because the principles of the Vedas, even that of Bhakti, even though Bhakti is considered to be simple, but we are at the stage when even those principles are sometimes confusing and contradicting one another. Um, Recently, we just crossed an Ekadashi, uh, which was actually observed on Dwadashi. So there was this whole in a temple amongst the devotees. There was this whole debate going on. The when should we follow Ekadashi? Almost everybody else was following Ekadashi the day before, other than within ISKCON. And then somebody uh, gave a kind of an explanation of how, and it was more of a astronomical explanation that how when the Ekadashi Tithi crosses over a certain part of the solar day, then it becomes contaminated by the night, and then Dwadashi. So there's some part of it. But even then, there were this people who were saying that they don't want to miss Ekadashi on Kartik month and want to make sure I follow it. So even in bhakti, there is room for in practice, there is room for possible speculation or interpretation. So by following the footsteps of the previous acharyas, by taking shelter of the uh, uh, of the guru, we are more or less protecting ourselves from inadvertent mistakes. So I think we can be assured that we will be making mistakes, but the principle is that as long as we are properly situated, those mistakes will be like the word that is used is by like toothless snakes. So when a toothless snake bites, then it may seem like the fangs are piercing, but there's no poison, so there's nothing that is impacting the does not impact really. Um, as long as these shelters are sought after, that one takes shelter of a guru, one follows the instructions of the guru to the best of their ability, one does not commit offenses of the any one of the 10 kinds, then one is protected from this inadvertent uh, misunderstandings or speculations.
Yeah, thank you. Um, Again, this is very subtle. Yeah, it's very to digest this part is that's the what I can say is the achievement for anyone.
Yes, you're right, Prabhu. For practicing devotees, it is difficult,
Yeah,
and
basically,
one
I'm
is always beset by, is this the right thing? Am I doing the right? Am I interpreting it correctly? Like sometimes people say that act according to your adhikar, don't be fanatical. But then what does that mean? What do I do? So there are all these conflicting notions. But the general principle is that as long as one is properly situated in the intentions, then even if there is any mistakes, they are their effect is limited.
in one's view, if it is a mistake as well, he will have his own assumption or speculation built up. Oh, this is the reference in the scriptures, this is the Vedas, but I did right. So it's all basically it's all digestion. How
It does happen. It does happen because the Vedas are open to interpretation and even devotional practices to some extent are open to interpretation. So one is able to One is able to align, rather than themselves aligning to them, they align those to them to themselves. Um, I remember I was having this discussion with a person who lived in the temple, and he was a temple devotee, and but he wasn't chanting. And so then I asked him, why aren't, and because I had a good relationship with him, so I said, why aren't you chanting? He said, well, the purpose of chanting is to get service. I have so much service, so um, there's no need for me to chant. The holy name has already served this purpose. It's given me so much opportunities to serve. Right? So yes, philosophically you can make that point, but something doesn't feel right about it, right? So you can understand there's some interpretation going on there.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. And one of the verses say that Yamraj is in constant contact with the super soul, and the super soul take the decision, and then Yamraj act upon it. And that means Yamraj has a very, very important role, and is very, very dear to the Supreme Lord as well, because not many devas has this type of relationship with the super soul. I mean, if we understand very well that Yamraj, he also resides in the heart with the super soul in a way, because they are assessing every karma, every auspicious and inauspicious activity that we're doing, and they both, like talk together and then decide. I mean, Yamraj is very, very dear to the. It's not an easy job, but it's quite an important job, because also, if this is just a speculation, this one, if we have to have a database to record all the karma and the thinking of everything, from a mosquito to every living entity, and over a period of time and lifetime, what type of database is that? How many gigabyte or terabyte or whatever we will have to have, if we think in terms of, okay, we're all some people, some IT people, if we had to construct something like that, it would be impossible to construct. But how this is being stored and evaluated, and constant feedback for every living entity, it's something that it cannot even imagine how it works.
Yeah, actually, somebody once asked Prabhupada almost exactly the same question. Prabhupada said yes, that Yamraj has to keep track of the actions in this universe, and Krishna keeps track of actions in all universes, and he does that effortlessly. So Yamraj is just a small sliver of Krishna's opulence. One can understand, get a sense of what is the opulence of Krishna. And not only in the material world, he also keeps track of all the desires of the jivas in the spiritual world, because there his mode is different. He's always anxious to fulfill the desires. So he's also keeping track of the spiritual world, which is three times the size of the material world. And you're right. The position of Yamraj is special. I mean, like I said, he's one of the 12 Mahajans. He's one of the Digpals, and one of the 33 prominent devas. So many categories he comes as special, special, special there, because of his because the nature of the service that he gets.
One more thing, Prabhu, Dharamraj, that means Yudhishthir, is a son of Yamraj as well. No? That means, and then the question that was asked, I think, by Kunti, there are so many demigods. Why do you want to take Yamraj as the first son, the father of the first son? And I think one of the reasons is because the Yamraj, that means Yamraj, he knows Dharam, what is wrong, what is right. And that's one of the reasons why he wanted a son from Yamraj.
True, true. And I believe in the Mahabharata is a conversation because Kunti Devi had this ability to call any Deva, and Pandu said first call Dhamra because he knew that the firstborn son would be the king. And he said very important for the king to be properly situated on the path of Dharma. So who better than Dharmaraj? And then of course came the other aspects of being strong enough to protect the kingdom and being valiant, chivalrous enough. So then Bhima and Arjun came. But because Pandu himself was an exalted personality, he understood that the foremost quality of an emperor would be to reflect this opulence of Dharmaraj of being understanding the Vedas and acting according to it.
Yes. Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice questions. Okay, moving on to verse 51. Tadetat sodashakalam lingam shaktitrayam mahad dhatenusham rishitam pumshi harshashoka bhayatridam. The subtle body is endowed with 16 parts: the five knowledge acquiring senses, the five working senses, the five objects of sense gratification, and the mind. The subtle body is an effect of the three modes of material nature. It is composed of insurmountably strong desires, and therefore it causes the living entity to transmigrate from one body to another in human life, animal life, and life as a demigod. When the living entity gets the body of a demigod, he is certainly very jubilant. When he gets a human body, he is always in lamentation. And when he gets the body of an animal, he is always afraid. In all conditions, however, he is actually miserable. His miserable condition is known as samsriti or transmigration in material life. So again, this is a summation of the, the entrapment of the jiva by the modes of material nature and the process of transmigration. So Prabhupada says that the sum and substance of material conditioned life is explained in this verse. The living entity, the 17th element, is struggling alone, life after life. This struggle is called samsriti or material conditional life. In Bhagavad Gita, it is said that the force of material nature is insurmountably strong. Devya yesha gunamahi mammaya duratyaya. Material nature harasses the living entity in different bodies, but if the living entity surrenders to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, it becomes free from this entanglement, as confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita. Mam evaye prapadyante mayam etan tarantite. Thus the life becomes successful. So the word asamsriti comes in the first verse of this chapter, used by Parishra Maharaj to describe the material miserable condition also. Just an observation. Verse 52. Deyagyo jita sadvargo nechan karmani karyate koshkarivatmanam karmana chadya muyate. The foolish embodied living entity, inept in controlling his senses and mind, is forced to act according to the influence of the modes of material nature, against his desire. He is like a silkworm that uses its own saliva to create a cocoon and then becomes trapped in it, with no possibility of getting out. The living entity traps himself in a network of his own fruitive activities and then can find no way to release himself. Thus, he is always bewildered and repeatedly he dies. So, though sometimes the jiva does not want to do impious activities, he is forced to do so by the subtle body. So, the analogy of the silkworm is used. And Prabhupada says that, as already explained, the influence of the modes of nature is very strong. The living entity is entangled in different kinds of fruitive activities, like a silkworm trapped in a cocoon. Getting free is very difficult unless he is helped by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Verse 53. Nahi kaschid shanamapi jatu tishtya karmakar karyate hayavash karma guna swabhavikar balat. Not a single living entity can remain unengaged even for a moment. One must act by his natural tendency according to the three modes of material nature, because this natural tendency forcibly makes him work in a particular way. So I'm sure you'll recognize that this is also a verse in Bhagavad Gita 3.5. Nai kashtakshanamapi jatu teshta karmakar karyate hayavash karma. The fourth line is different. It says sarva prakrite jayar guna. So it's different in the verbiage, but the meaning is the same. The verse is essentially the same also. Right? The Yamadutas had noted that everyone in the material world is a suitable candidate for punishment because they're involved in some form of karma. Right? Here they're expanding, saying that why are they involved in some form of karma? Guna swabhi balat, because of the force of the material nature. And nahi kashyak shanamapi jatu tishya karma krat. Right? So, on the one hand, the jiva cannot stay inactive, and the other hand, when the jiva becomes active, he is forced to act by the modes of material
10 minutes go to
nature.
10 minutes. You can go. You can start. You can start awake, please. They're waiting for you.
So Srila Prabhupada says that the Subhavika or one's natural tendency is the most important factor in action. One's natural tendency is to serve because the living entity is an eternal servant of the Lord. Okay, moving on to verse 54. I'm going a little quickly because we are all very familiar with this philosophy. So this is just like a revision. Verse 54. लब्ध्वा निमित्तम् अव्यक्तं व्यक्ताव्यक्तं भवत्युत यथा योनि यथा बीजं स्वभावेन बलीयस्य. The fruitive activities a living being performs, whether pious or impious, are the unseen cause for the fulfillment of his desires. This unseen cause is the root for the living entity's different bodies. Because of his intense desire, the living entity takes birth in a particular family and receives a body which is either that of his mother or like that of his father. The gross and subtle bodies are created according to his desire. Right? So, this is an ongoing explanation of the cycle of reincarnation. So, driven by desire, the jiva perform pious or impious activities. These pious or impious activities cause further desires, which again result in further pious and impious activities. And because of these desires, the jivas continue to take on different bodies in which they perform further activities, which results in new desires, which results in a new body. So, in this way, the cycle continues. So, Prabhupada said the subtle body, which is called linga, the body of desire, is the background for the development of a particular type of gross body, which is either like that of one's mother or like that of one's father. According to the Rig Veda, if at the time of sex the secretions of the mother are more profuse than those of the father, the child will receive a female body. And if the secretions of the father are more profuse than those of the mother, the child will receive a male body. These are the subtle laws of nature which act according to the desire of the living entity. So, since the subtle body determines one's next birth, yam yam vapi smaran bhavam, Srila Prabhupada knows that it is important to train the subtle body to think of Krishna at the time of death. Verse 55. Esha prakriti sangena purushasya viparyaya asit sayeva na chirat isha sangad viliyate. Since the living entity is associated with the material nature, he is in an awkward position. But in the human form of life, he is taught how to associate with the Supreme Personality of Godhead or his devotee. This position can be overcome. So now the Vishnu Dutas are talking about the way to escape this seemingly invincible law of karma and incarnation. Right? So at one point they are saying that by the association of Prakriti, one is committed to perpetual bondage. But now they are saying by the association of the Lord, one becomes liberated. So this clearly indicates that the Yamdutas are fully aware of the conditions that lead to rebirth, and they're also fully aware of the conditions that lead to liberation. However, they're probably not fully aware of the potency of the holy name, and that is why this pastime is happening. So Prabhupada summarizes the statements of the Yamadutas in the purport. He says that in summary, the living entity is an eternal servant of God, but he comes to the material world and is bound by the material condition because of his desire to lord it over matter. Liberation means giving up this false consciousness and reviving one's original service to the Lord. Thus, this return to the original life is called mukti, as confirmed in the Bhagavatam 2.10.6. Muktir hityanta rupam swarupena vyastiti. Right? So, this verse summarizes both the situation of bondage and that of liberation. So, this essentially is the end of the conversation between the Vishnu Dutas and Yam Dutas in terms of the question and answer. So I'll summarize the 5 questions that were asked by the Vishnu Dutas and the answers given. So in the verse 38, they had said that, asked that Dharmasya Tattvam, what is religion? And the Yamdutas had said, Veda Pranahito Dharma. That which is prescribed in the Vedas constitute dharma. Then they had asked in the same verse 38, Adharmasya Lakshanam, what is irreligion? And again in verse 40, the Yamdutas had said that Adharmas Tattva Vipraya, that which is not prescribed in the Vedas is Adharma. Then the Vishnu Dutas in verse 39 had asked, who is punished? And in verse 43, the Vishnu Dutas respond that everyone engaged in fruitive activities is suitable to be punished according to his sinful activities. Then the Vishnu Dutas had asked, how is this punishment administered? And in verse 45, the Yamdutas say that the jivas are punished in proportion to the pious and sinful activities performed by them. Essentially, the law of karma. And the 5th question that they asked, also in verse 39, is what are the reasons for punishment? Right? And the Yamadutas, they say that because of his, so this answer will come later on, and actually towards the end of the chapter. In verse 68, they give 3 reasons why, and this they use Ajmal as an example, why Ajmal is being punished. They say that 1, he led a sinful life. 2, he did not undergo atonement. And 3, as per the law of karma, he has to be punished and thus purified. Right? So these are the 5 question and answers by the Vishnu Dutas and from the Yam Dutas, from the Vishnu Dutas. So let's move on to the so now the Yamdutas will start talking about specifically the life of Ajmer. So we'll go to verse 56, 57. Ayam Shruta Sampanna Shilvrata Gunalayaha Dhritvrato Mridurdanta Satyavan Mantra Vichushi Garbhaganyatiti Vridhanam Shushurushur Ahankrata Sarvabhuta Suhurt Sadhur Mitavad Anasuyakaha. In the beginning, this Brahman named Ajmela studied all the Vedic literatures. He was a reservoir of good character, good conduct, and good qualities. Firmly established in executing all the Vedic injunction, he was very mild and gentle. and he kept his mind and senses under control. Furthermore, he was always truthful. He knew how to chant the Vedic mantras, and he was also very pure. Ajamel was very respectful to his spiritual master, the fire god, guest, and the elderly members of his household. Indeed, he was free from false prestige. He was upright, benevolent to all living entities, and well behaved. He would never speak nonsense or envy anyone. So, from verse 56 till 68, the end of the chapter, the fall down of Ajmail is described. So, the Yamadutas, having spoken about dharma and adharma, they are now going to speak specifically about Ajmail life in both the phases. How his earlier life was dharmic and his later life was adharmic. So, in these two verses, 56, 57, they are talking about Ajmail's prior dharmic life in order to contrast it with his later adharmic life. Prabhupada says that Shri Veera Raghav Acharya comments that Dhritvrata means Dhritvratam, Stri Sangha Rahitakya Brahmacharya Rupam. In other words, Ajmail followed the rules and regulations of celibacy as a perfect brahmachari and was very soft hearted, truthful, clean, and pure. How he fell down in spite of all these qualities and came to be threatened with punishment by Yamraj will be described in the following verses. So it's interesting that the Yamadutas they are so liberal in glorifying Ajmer. Like if you look at the verse, they actually glorify 14 qualities of Ajmer. That he is Shruta Sampanna, well educated in Vedic knowledge. He is Shila Vrita Gunalaya, that he is a reservoir of good character, conduct, and qualities. He is Ditrvata, he is fixed in the execution of Vedic injunction. Mridu, be very mild and gentle. Dantaha, that he was completely controlling his mind and senses. Satyavak, always truthful. Mantravit, that he knew how to chant the Vedic hymns. Suchi, he was always neat and clean. Then Gurvagnya Atithi Pradham Shushurshur, that he was very respectful to Guru, spiritual master, Agni, fire god, Atithi, guests, and Vradhana, to the elders. So being respectful to the fire god means that he was performing yajnas on a regular basis. Then Ahankarta, that he was without pride or false prestige. Then Sarvabhuta Suhurt, that he was friendly to all living entities. Sadhu, well behaved. Mitavak, that he would not speak any nonsense. And Anasuyakaha, that he was not envious of anyone. Okay, so now okay, so maybe we'll do this verse. I don't think I'll complete the chapter. Not many verses left, but I'll stop after this verse. On this, there are three verses that are coming together, 58 to 60. Ekada suvanam yata pitra sandesha kritvijaha adaya tata avrata फलपुष्प समित कुशान ददृशकामिनं कंचेन शूद्रं सह भुजिष्यया हित्वा च मधुमैरेयं मधुगूर्णितनेत्रया मतया विशल मतया विशल्थन् निव्या व्यपेतं निरापत्रम् Kridantam Anugayantam Hasantam Anayantike. Once this Brahman Ajamil, following the order of his father, went to the forest to collect fruits, flowers, and two kinds of grass called Samit and Kusha. On the way home, he came upon a Shudra, a very lusty fourth class man, who was shamelessly embracing and kissing a prostitute. The Shudra was smiling, singing, and enjoying as if this were proper behavior. Both the Shudra and the prostitute were drunk. The prostitute's eyes were rolling in intoxication and her dress had become loose. Such was the condition in which Ajmail saw them. So, despite the glorious qualities, we see that Ajmail became affected by this sight. So, what does it tell us? That piety is not strong enough to support from the impulses of the senses. So, piety is like a row of petals that they are nicely engaged, they look beautifully. But when the first wind comes, they will get scattered. Spirituality or Krishna consciousness is like the thread which will hold these petals in a garland. So, unless piety is supported by a strong thread of Krishna consciousness, it remains fallible. So, Prabhupada writes in the purport that in Kali Yuga, a drunk, half naked woman embracing a drunk man is a very common sight, especially in Western countries. And restraining oneself after seeing such things is very difficult. Nevertheless, if by the grace of Krishna one adheres to the regulative principles and chants the Hare Krishna mantra, Krishna will certainly protect him. Indeed, Krishna says that his devotee is never vanquished. Kaunteya pratijanahi na me bhaktya pranashyati. Therefore, all the disciples practicing Krishna consciousness should obediently follow the regulative principles and remain fixed in chanting the holy name of the Lord. Then there need be no fear. Otherwise, one's position is very dangerous, especially in the Kali Yuga. Okay, so I'm going to stop over here. They're just 8 verses, but I think I don't want to rush through them. I also wanted to take some time to summarize the chapter. So next week we will resume from verse 61. And like I said, there are only 8 more verses, which also are not very exhaustive verses. If there's any questions or comments, we can take them now. Okay, if not, then we'll end. Thank you so much. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubheva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Anant Koti Vaishnavinda ki jai. Jila Prabhupada ki jai. Sai Gaur Premanande. Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. Thank you so much.